Okay, so first of all, just a quick note on the format. This is a roundtable, so we don't have presentations prepared. But I do have a set of questions that I'm going to pose to the panelists here, and it's going to help us guide the discussion. I'm not going to do a lot here. I'm simply going to help us kind of get started and stay on track, and encourage you all to join the conversation. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Gil Sarmiento. I'm an assistant professor in urban planning at Columbia University. Today's session is titled Who Recovered and Who Did Not. But really the focus of the discussion is on housing justice. Thinking about access to housing, opportunities in housing, in a context of an increasing climate risk and a severe housing deficit in New York City. So today we have an incredible lineup who will talk about their work as it relates to this topic. And the first thing we're going to introduce ourselves, and then I'm going to pose the first question and give our panelists an opportunity to respond, and all of you to join the conversation as well. So starting with Rachel, can you please present yourself, your work, and maybe a couple other notes relevant to the topic here today.
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Meltzer. I'm on the faculty of the Urban Planning program at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. And I'm here today, as I understand it, because a lot of my research broadly looks at how resilient neighborhoods are in the face of all different kinds of shocks. But I have looked specifically at Hurricane Sandy, but broadly other things that kind of come in and really change the trajectory of neighborhoods, usually, in ways that, are not under the control of the people living there. And a lot of the outcomes that I look at really are more in the economic space. So the work related to Sandy has looked at how the storm impacted local businesses in neighborhoods that were hit, both kind of severely and less severe, and kind of using those differences to understand how the storm impacts the viability of those businesses, and in turn the services that they provide to those communities. So really thinking about it holistically. I've also looked at the impact of the storm on housing outcomes, and understanding again how really these big events, a storm like Sandy, hit a large swath of the Northeast, but had really diverse impacts on the ground. And I'll, as we get into discussion, talk about some of the specific findings, what came out of it, but the general takeaway is that, a lot of what informed that we found the outcomes for neighborhoods was really how, prepared they were for this event leading up to it. I mean, it just kind of kept coming back to that pattern in different ways. But my work kind of tries to put data to these stories that we hear over and over. Wasn't necessarily surprising what we found, but we were finding it in, really systematic ways that I think with some hard evidence behind the narratives that we're exploring a lot. So, looking forward to the conversation.
Hello, my name is Christy Peel. I've been the executive director at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods since 2012, actually. And our mission is to promote and protect affordable homeownership. We work in multiple ways. Two of the ways that I'm going to talk about today are, we make sure homeowners who are looking for assistance, if they're at risk of foreclosure or they've been impacted by an event like Sandy, get access to free and trusted help from a network of housing, counseling, and legal services providers across the city. And in fact, we work with groups all over the state. We often are able to get homeowners and their tenants direct financial assistance. And then we also do a lot of work in the public sphere in terms of engaging stakeholders in conversations around affordable homeownership, issues around climate justice, the racial homeownership gap. We were fortunate that a number of our groups were working in neighborhoods impacted by Sandy, and were able to immediately respond after the event in neighborhoods like East Flatbush, Canarsie, Staten Island, Queens, and Brooklyn, and obviously the Northwest Bronx as well. We really built capacity on an infrastructure that was built to respond to the foreclosure crisis, and figured out ways to get people information on insurance claims, FEMA filings, and later CDBG issues, SBA denials. I mean, we got really technical with a lot of the information, and it ended up working both within government systems and partnering with BuildAback and outside of government in delivering assistance through a number of philanthropic approaches. So we were really grateful that we were able to get a number of donors and philanthropies and foundations together to provide some additional assistance to kind of complement the BuildAback approach. The other thing I'll say is that our work on recovery really transitioned into resilience. We've been working with the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery to get homeowners resiliency counseling, flood audits of their homes with engineers, flood insurance certificates so they understand what rates they should be charged with flood insurance, and have thought a lot around how we transition from talking not just about seawater rise and the impact of flooding, but also stormwater flooding and how that's impacting homeowners, and how we need to help folks be both financially and physically prepared for flooding and other climate-related issues. So much more to say, but that's what I am here, I think.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Mazuka. I teach at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, which is within the Columbia Climate School. We teach a series of courses on housing recovery and economic recovery after disasters, walking through best practices, the type of government programs that may be available via FEMA, as well as possibly community development block grant disaster recovery funding administered by HUD. Earlier this year, I was an International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I was actually in residence in Japan, though, at Kyoto University, researching community-based disaster risk reduction policies, how the Japanese across the country approach disasters both from a preparedness standpoint as well as response and recovery. But the reason why I think I'm on this panel is in my prior life, I was in state government with the state of New Jersey and our Sandy Recovery Division. I served as assistant director from 2015 to 2019, responsible for our housing restoration grant programs, which were funded by the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funding Vehicle. I look forward to the conversation today.
Okay, so the first question, recognizing that housing recovery in the post-Sandy context was uneven, based on your work and from your positions in the academy and in organizations that focus on affordable housing and meeting the needs of underserved communities, from those positions, what do you think were the major challenges that policy and the regulatory environment presented for recovery?
So, well, if I can just jump in, I think the first thing that we saw with Sandy that hopefully wasn't replicated in a number of other disasters is there was such a long time lag from the time that the major, disaster declaration, when the storm hit, the disaster declaration was made, and when we ultimately got our CDBG plan submitted. I mean, I think it was months before Congress passed.
Months, correct. Congress passed, if memory serves me, in January, and then the bill was signed off in, I think, February, if memory serves me.
Right.
Programs only really launched in June-ish, summertime.
Right, so that was a full year after the storm hit. So I think that time was incredibly painful for families and neighborhoods where there's concentrated impact. And that's, where really, again, there was a really amazing demonstration of community response, not just through organizations like Occupy Sandy, but a lot of faith-based organizations, the Red Cross. There was, a huge private response to make up for the public delay. And those resources were really important over the lifetime of the recovery because they were able to really fill in where the federal money couldn't touch. So, for example, a lot of recent immigrants to the country who were so-called undocumented and able to access some federal programs, and we were really, again, grateful to be able to draw on some private resources to provide assistance. both the direct, family financial assistance is actually rebuilding as well.
I would add to that, not just the financial assistance, but also the communication. And across the board, not just for LAP populations, but just the population in general. The nonprofits, long-term recovery group, faith-based organizations really do support government in an area which everyone wishes government could be better at, which is communicating out the programs that exist, what they do, what they don't do, as well as other resources that may be available out there that are outside of the government programs.
And I'll just add, I mean, you two have much better grasp firsthand of the policy and the implementation on the ground, but all I can say again is in the research we've done, it's supported these stories. So just two examples. The work we did looking at outcomes for businesses, which is not in the housing space, but actually, we found some pretty stark results that, the storm had disproportionately bigger impacts on smaller retail kind of street-facing businesses. And our interpretation was that these were the kinds of businesses that are very place-based. They can't pick up and just move what they're doing to another location, right? So if their physical space is damaged, they're done. And right, these businesses are operating on such a thin margin under good times that this was just, more than the last straw. So in terms of resources, you talk about what there is no insurance, right? There's no kind of insurance mechanism in place to stop that gap for businesses. And I think even if it came in a year later, there's just some entities that are so vulnerable that one, those 2 months are enough. So thinking about, the timing and the preparedness of having these resources, something that can jump in immediately, because there's just different kind of tiers of being able to stretch out that kind of holding on, until that bigger lump of money comes in. And on the housing side, what we were seeing is, again, we looked at housing prices in our research. Again, not doesn't capture everything, but we think housing prices do give us a sense of, again, a very place-based, location-tied understanding of how this asset, is valued, and a big storm should be kind of capitalized, or internalized or reflected in that asset and how it's valued. And again, what people are willing essentially to pay to live there, And so if this risk now is bigger, perceived to be bigger, we assume that people will pay less to be there. And that's what we found, So we see that the storm comes in and pushes prices down kind of across the board. But where we actually saw the biggest, most persistent effect was in areas outside the flood zone. So these were homes that not only probably were less likely to have the insurance, and even again, to kind of help with repairs afterwards. But you mentioned information and communication. Our other interpretation, and we teased it out in other ways, is a lot of this was just information about risk. And so after Sandy comes in, you don't have the insurance to kind of physically pull things up. But what we also found is prices were going down for places that even weren't, as we understood it, severely damaged. So this was an information story. This was about, I'm in a risky place now and I need to kind of, internalize that and understand it. So I think a lot of the lead up to these events, just understanding again what your risk is, and then, understanding what you do next. But information is a powerful piece of this, so much so that we see the market, prices reflected, and persistently so. They didn't recover, especially in lower income neighborhoods. So this was the other piece that this was particularly felt in lower income neighborhoods, that prices went down and didn't recover like in higher income neighborhoods. And again, we interpret that as even those homes, those people who didn't have insurance had resources to rebuild. So resources and information, those were the two kind of channels that we found were important.
I think the place-based nature of what you're talking about is so important in New York, especially when you look at what overlapping so much with our historically and the disproportionate impact on communities of color. And what we saw with the lack of information is that not just business owners and homeowners really still don't necessarily know what their public is. So we've worked a lot with the city and the mayor's office of climate and economic justice to get out information on flood risk. There's a tool we continually updated called Flood Help and Why. Go in there and really kind of understand where your property is, what some sources are, really understand what flood risk means to you.
It's that or it's like.
Of course, not everything has access.
The comment on it.
Today, we have LiDAR data, and then we have all this complicated data sets, but if you don't have access to the internet or you're not, literate in that way, then it's not useful. So we started to figure out ways to make it available offline as well and produce it in a printed form. Because it's still not required by law to disclose your flood risk, right? If you go to buy a home today, you're a realtor, nobody is required to tell you what your flood zone is or what your flood risk is. And that's not, again, not even taking into extent what we've learned since the tragedies with Ida about stormwater impacts as well. So I think we have actually started to do more on the education side as a result of Sandy, and I think that's a thing that we can invest more in and kind of lean in deeper. But the resources that come after the education is the other piece that we need more.
Yeah, well, and another kind, but the mandate, like you said, the thing about flood insurance, even with its, its imperfections, is that it is it has been a mechanism, or how it's tied, I must say, for example, to finance, right? Like when you get a mortgage and the tie to the flood insurance. Again, imperfections, but that has been a mechanism in some ways to to kind of ensure protection among some subset. Now, I think it came up in the other panel that the take is still really low. It's not. So it's thinking about these ways to, because information goes so far, but then you need the teeth behind something,
And the tools.
the tools, right, and then to follow up with it. But it just seemed like, and that, outside the flood zone, it was kind of, because people had insurance, we saw it in the data, but it was, we were actually trying to understand, we couldn't figure out, like, what information did you have to tell you to get flood insurance outside the zone, and that could have made a difference for you.
When you were doing research on property values, have you gone back subsequently? One of the things, I'm curious because I think with the housing crisis, I'm curious to know how much property values have bounced back in these neighborhoods where they should, right? Like
Where they should have or shouldn't, or
should not,
should not.
right? Like people should not be buying houses in the flood zone. However, if you're dealing with a housing crisis citywide and you're looking for a place to go and homes in the flood zone are lower priced, that's what I'm curious about, because I think that's really cautionary.
Yeah, well, so what we found was in the flood zone after Sandy, like everywhere, there was an immediate drop in prices. So there was this immediate response. In the flood zone, it recovered almost entirely very quickly. Our data analysis went up through 2018. So we haven't looked since, but again, the story there is actually those prices in some way already capitalized that risk. Now, it might have not been perfectly capitalized because of the pricing of flood insurance, but that's what it did, right? So in that regard, you could say that prices maybe still should not be as high as they are, but it's doing its job in the sense, like, it did have information before the storm about risk, and that suggested it. Outside the flood zone, we saw the drop immediately, and in higher income neighborhoods, it recovered. In lower income neighborhoods, it did not, and we interpret that again as a resource story, or kind of expectations of neighborhood, that in certain neighborhoods, to your point, like the market is just so tight that, the expectation. The other thing that came up in the research that is a little kind of dry, related, is we did some research on if there were any changes we were looking at Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, which is on the, it's based on mortgage information, but it gives us information on the race of the mortgage holders and the income. And we did see changes. We didn't see kind of persistent shifts or as convincing shifts in the income of the applicants, but we saw that the probability that the applicants identified as Black or Hispanic went up in neighborhoods and areas that were harder hit. So again, prices were going down, and then what we were seeing is actually a shift in kind of the demographics of the buyers that were going into these neighborhoods. could be that those markets kind of, I don't know, lower prices opened it up, in a sense to different buyers, but there's something else going on that it's changing, the nature of these communities, but also, the market. So to your initial question is, no indication that, in the flood zone, that the storm had any persistent, changes in the pricing.
And Rachel, in your research, did you look at primary versus secondary homes? Because that's one of the things anecdotally.
We only looked at single family, I also should
Yeah.
clarify,
Yeah.
because with single family, there's not enough, we didn't have enough volume of sales in the other type
Yeah.
of properties to like confidently say something. We couldn't distinguish between.
Yeah, because anecdotally, we're seeing that in the Jersey Shore, neighborhoods that were very primary becoming more secondary.
Right, and that's one of the things we try to control for in New York, is just that.
Yeah, although in New York City, I mean, how many, you're saying people will leave the city now and then like rent out the place they live here, or?
That if you couldn't help people stay in their homes, as Chrissy was
Yeah.
particularly, we needed, sorry, I really don't mean that.
No.
In New York City, we were aware that there are people of sort of more moderate income homeowners who we really wanted them to be able to stay in their communities, right? That they had given blood, sweat, and tears to their neighborhoods, and they deserved to stay there. And so that's why, of course, the city managed the construction process, because doing construction in New York is a headache. On the Jersey Shore and on Long Island, the decisions by the government were to give grants directly to homeowners.
It was mixed.
I'm
We
sorry?
did some construction management by the state and some by homeowners.
So what ended up happening was that if you had more resources, and remember this time lag, which was real, like money really didn't come online for a year. or
No, we
so
saw it in the permit data.
So that meant that if you didn't have if you couldn't do it, you just could not, then you were gonna have to just sell your house. Because the amount of money that was coming from, and he would know much better, the state of New Jersey, or the state of New York, was not enough to actually be able to help you. So people walked away. So that meant the people who might have been living there for generations as of their first home left, and then you had people who bought second homes.
And specifically on the second home point that I was making, less about immediately after the disaster, although some of that did happen, but more looking at the 5-10 year time horizon. What we're seeing now is neighborhoods that were primary residents still did rebuild, and people were living there in 2015, year 2022, we have more secondary now. The transition's happening.
But I think that's more of a national story, although I think it's changing with the more recent tragedies in Florida as well. I think there were a lot more primary homeowners on the west side of Florida, recent retirees who, made it their primary home. But that image of, coastal homeowners being, second homeowners was really, really challenging when we were trying to help in Far Rockaway and all over where everyone's like, oh, well, people should just move. You should just do coastal retreats. Like, well, when we started to look at acquisition and relocation options, it was really, really challenging even then. And imagine if Sandy, another Sandy happened tomorrow, with interest rates over 7% now, it would be so hard to look at a viable, acquisition and relocation program. So I do think there's less of that mindset that, coastal homeowners are, wealthy, white, and second homeowners, but that was a real challenge in trying to get resources in New York. And I think because FEMA is such a national program and is perceived to be kind of, again, subsidizing wealthy owners on the shore as opposed, not your shore.
No.
But it really required a lot of pushback at the time.
Now,
And still does.
moving on beyond homeowners, we know most residents in New York City are not homeowners. Can you speak to that experience in the recovery process? What about non-homeowners? What about the national policies that privilege homeowners that are now being operationalized in a very complex market environment with a whole range of variations in tenure and ownership patterns? What was that experience?
Well, I think there's been a lot of really good national advocacy to try and get the disaster response infrastructure that's obviously not just FEMA, but HUD and the CDBG-DR resources responsive to tenants. I think what we saw post Harvey and Irma and Maria is that the federal government was able to provide rental resources, sometimes in synthetic vouchers and sometimes actual rental assistance. But often it's, you know, frankly, what we saw with COVID, it's a hoteling response. It's a real temporary relocation assistance, as opposed to, you know, as you said, looking at the climate crisis as a housing crisis, one in which we need to lean in on the production of new affordable rentals before the next crisis, as opposed to, you know, having to move people out of harm's way once it happens. But being someone who focuses on homeownership, we really looked at you know, homeowners who had renters and how we could assist the renters.
It all comes down to the state, the grantee, in this case, the state, or in the city of New York was of course treated like a state under the CDBG DR funding vehicle, of what kind of programs they want to design and manage. And often the focus historically has been homeowners. There's no two ways about it. I mean, we did have an affordable rental program where we assisted landlords rebuilding small rental housing. But the numbers in that program pale in comparison to the homeowner program. And it comes back to the point I mentioned at the beginning about communication. I think things are as important as how much money you devote as do you get the word out. And get the word out at the beginning. Because programs are either designed one of two ways. Either you have your application period and then you're done, or you have rolling, multiple application periods. In case in New Jersey, for better or for worse, we did a single application period initially. Thus, communication matters. You want to get as many people into a program as possible.
No, I was gonna say, which came up before with the renter side, and I mean, I think the privileging of homeownership is a big, right, there's a lot of reasons in this country, but again, it's like, what's the mechanism? Like, how do you reach those renters, right, in a way, in an immediate way? So like, what is it, the EHAP, the rental assistance program, that, right? I wonder, you might know better than me. I mean, I know some stories around, you know, can we learn something from that program about, you know, offering assistance, you know, and whether it goes through the renter, whether it goes through the landlord, you know, I mean, there's questions of fairness and equity, but there's also questions of just expediency, you know, and I think on the renter side, same thing, you know, we don't really have renters insurance, we talk, you know, like in some, again, similarly kind of subsidized way. So it's just, it's some of it's about just like the political or ideological prioritizing of this community, which tends to be lower income, you know, it goes along with it, but it's also, I think in order to design these interventions, you really do have to think very carefully about the like the levers, right? What, you know, and with home ownership, again, right, when you have a mortgage, like there's these points of entry that you can exploit, you know, when you're trying to impose mandates, or, and with renters, it's trickier, and yeah, so I think it's not impossible, but I think you can't just take the home ownership, I think, model and then just slap it on the, you know.
And the other thing to keep in mind for home rule states like New Jersey or Massachusetts, for instance, home rule states are when municipalities basically control zoning, building codes, that type of thing, versus the county level. And municipalities may want to change the makeup of the number of units per home. So they may make it less dense. And we've seen that in some communities in New Jersey, which means then less rental housing after the disaster. Because to rebuild, you can't rebuild a 4-family home, you only rebuild a 2-family home, for instance. So it's taking it offline. Even when the state's intentions may be pure and good about restoring rental housing, municipalities may be changing their own rules. So this is something to keep in mind.
You have a question?
How about, I guess, renters' rights? So for instance, I live in Boston, and thanks to my, you know, the landlord's obligation to have a like heat system in place, you know, I was able not to freeze when heating broke. And in the same way, now with thinking about climate adaptation policy, some states are considering having certain requirements of air conditioning or otherwise helping renters to pay for air conditioning during heat waves. So how about, you know, having also requirements for either homeowners to accept and, you know, have to retrofit their homes, or, you know, some sort of mandate if your house is in a certain place too.
It's interesting because in New York City, there are a huge number of rental units in those 4-family homes, but there's the much greater proportion of renter units are in much larger multifamily buildings. And I think the city based on recent legislation and recent state legislation, will have to improve the sustainability of, all of the landlords will have to, improve their systems and plans to be greener and more sustainable, but I don't think that's the same as sort of ensuring renter safety and preparedness. And we've seen that a lot with the conversation on basements. Again, since we had, tragic loss of life with Ida, we're really trying to think about, how do we make basement units safe and affordable, but also how do we protect tenants with information so they know, what the risk of a potential unit is and how to be prepared. Somebody was saying earlier, to have that go bag and really understand how to be connected to communities of resilience so that when, we may be in place and how to get out. But I think that it requires a huge amount of investment, not obviously just in the physical buildings, but in the community of outreach and engagement.
Well, you have like correlates, you think about the child bar, the child bars on the window, right? I don't know, I sign all those right? You have the waivers. So like, I don't know, I'm actually, I teach policy. I'm a policy, I'm not actually, I'm a kind of infiltrating, right, the planners, but so like thinking about like, how do you, find correlates? How do you, can you, find these like
an at least
low hanging fruit, right? And so like in the same way you have to certify that I signed that waiver about the child protection bars, maybe there's something, related. So, and that's again about an information channel because it tells the tenant, oh, I should be paying attention to this, and it puts the landlord, they have to, kind of go through an extra step to like ensure. So I don't, that's why I think, you have to be creative, at all these different scales, because, I mean, the reality is you can't, the recovery, the resilience is not gonna happen with big federal money. I mean, like, the cities just don't have the cost, right, the coffers to support that, but like, they do, right, talk about home rule, they do have the authority to do other things, at the local scale, and so they really have to, be creative and, again, find those levers. But yeah, some of it's easier said than done, obviously. There's a lot of groups that will debate over, right?
So we have less than 10 minutes left.
Oh my gosh,
So
really?
I want to give you all an opportunity to pose questions. We have tremendous experience in the room. Raul, you had a question?
My name is Raul Santiago Bartolomé. I'm from the University of Puerto Rico in research in post-disaster recovery after Maria. I was wondering, at one point of comparison, I heard that CDBGDR funds were approved about a year after Sandy. In the case of Puerto Rico, it was 2 years.
Much more, yeah.
Yeah.
It was a good length in the case of what happened here with Sandy, in comparison to most other disasters across the country.
I would say neither one is really acceptable.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we can make improvements.
But I want to perhaps see if we can provide some reflections on thoughts on those questions on renters in terms of the time frame. Because it's not only that renters are more likely to be excluded from, say, FEMA's individual assistance. It's a year then from CDBGR, then depends on the kind of housing programs that are approved. Likely many are excluded after that. And if they're really waiting for hazard mitigation projects, those don't really take place until 4 or 5 years after. So would that increase the likelihood? Well, two things. First, at least in Puerto Rico, with research results, we noticed that difference recovery rate has implications for housing prices afterwards. So places recover quicker, housing prices go up a lot quicker. Places that are lagging are deteriorating faster, but also households leave those places in higher rates as well, especially because of that reason. So I was wondering if you experienced something similar or ways that could improve that period of time of addressing the needs for renters. It seems to be a lot more extended than for homeowners. And not only exclusion from programs, but the temporality. It's not the same for either one.
And when you say, I just want to clarify your question, when you say improve for renters in that time period,
Yeah.
are you saying in providing rental assistance, or are you saying in connecting to available housing? I just want to make sure I understand your question.
Whichever option is
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it's a challenge when it comes to rental assistance, as much as what FEMA offers, you as a state or a territory commonwealth can also create programs under HUD to create rental assistance when it goes beyond the 18 months that FEMA may provide. In the case of New Jersey, we did that, particularly for those homeowners who were in our program who all of a sudden became renters for a long period of time. It becomes a much harder question to answer, one that I don't have the ability to, when we say the number of rental units is off the market. What do you do with this many renters at this point? I don't have the answer, but that is a problem you see in some places. New Jersey, less so, just because the numbers worked out for us. But I don't know if any of the other panelists have any comments on that front.
I mean, I think one of the things that I heard from my colleagues in the tenant representation space was that we had the analog in the mortgage space was around forbearances, right? So we would get a limited forbearance period for Fannie and Freddie where you could delay paying the mortgage, and then there was still a delay with the federal resources, so we would ask for an extension, we would get the extension. So that was in 2012, where we were getting 90-day extensions on mortgage forbearances. By the time COVID happened, Fannie and Freddie came out automatically and said, people can apply for up to 6 months with an automatic 6-month extension for forbearances, which was huge. And again, there's not as much, there are not as many effective tools in the same way in the rental space, and that we need not just for disaster assistance, but with COVID as well. But what I heard post Sandy was that the city created, like I said, a synthetic voucher. They took some CDBG or some other funds and they created a way to give people rental assistance, but they were time limited. And again, we would have to say, all right, well, we have it for 12 months, but we need it extended because the recovery always takes longer and longer. So I think planning for those extended periods and being able to give the landlord then the assurance that, hey, I'm coming with this disaster voucher, but I know that the government's going to be behind it for more than 6 months, for 12 months to 2 years. Really, I mean, I don't know that anybody that recovered in less than 5 years. I don't know, is that fair to say?
It depends where they started.
That's
In
true.
that, if some people had a rainy day fund and were able to start their work and then use some of the federal dollars to get over the finish line, we saw recoveries within 1 year.
Yeah.
But it depends where you start.
But I do think states and localities could plan for, front loading those rental assistance programs in a way that landlords are ready to take the funds and ready to keep people, keep renter families in place. But I think the other issue I think you mentioned was, how do we have kind of an overflow capacity, right? And again, we saw this with COVID, where we were really pushing to get people who are unhoused, permanent housing in hotels. And it was really challenging to make that happen in New York. California had a much better success rate. So there's some models that just are easier to implement in some places than others. And I think the last thing I'll say is that it's devastating to think about, communities not getting the resources they need and then continuing to backslide without that. But I feel like I've heard that some of the solar alternative energy investments in Puerto have helped sort of bridge some of those gaps. You feel like that's
it's very specific. I mean,
it's not widespread.
not widespread.
You had another question?
I'm gonna yield it. Somebody. Another one.
I have it.
Okay, I'm gonna try to make a sense of it, but and I feel it's kind of more naive than what everybody has been saying, but there is this paradox around coastlines, which is that they are pretty and that people want to live in them, and a lot of development has happened in the floodplain, whichever floodplain you refer to in New York City, and a lot of that development has been branded as resilient, and there is concern that a lot of this resilient development and that resilient housing is kind of an asset or kind of like a push forward, like as a luxury. So who is earning the access to choosing where to live, even if, and it's paradoxical because that means that people might be choosing to pay more to live close to the water, but also because they can afford living in resilient housing. So I don't know, I see a lot of controversies there.
Well, I think, again, in New York, there we have, the terrible history of Robert Moses and redlining and really displacing a lot of lower income housing to our shore. So we have that weird thing, where people were pushed out to low neighborhoods of low opportunity, that were also high risk. So, to see neighborhoods like that become, luxury housing is, luxury resilient housing is particularly galling for, people, especially when NYCHA has been, has tried to really, I think, improve a lot of those facilities, but, a lot of the, investment of CDBG dollars in NYCHA buildings, again, has been slower, but, I do think that's a place where the city did try and take advantage of federal resources to invest in certain developments. Didn't happen across the board. I don't know what that's what to say on NYCHA. But I think that, I think, I don't know, I don't think I can answer your question about luxury, but I just wanted to mention that piece.
Well, I mean, again, I don't know if I have a solution or answer, but kind of a comment that I think, right, this debate or deep conversation about where we should be developing, and if we do develop, right, should it be resilient? I think that, or the thing that is really, I find difficult, right, about that scenario is that resilient but luxury housing that's also getting subsidized by the government. So it's one scenario to say you want to build luxury housing and pay for it, like insure it yourself, like internalize that cost, or we'll charge you some kind of impact fee, right? I mean, you want to live there because of the pretty views or what it is. There's a cost to that because there's a big risk to being there for you, but also it affects a lot of other people because we're paying for it. And when you can't live there anymore, you're probably going to go outbid someone else. So it has these broader social costs.
Right.
So I think it's not this dichotomy of like build or don't build, but it's like who's going to bear the cost of that. And I think that's the troubling part, is that those things get built and they are being subsidized through the insurance market, through other things. So I think we just have to rethink, right, the way we price risk and finance it, and who ends up paying for it, because, and this goes back to what, like, subsidized insurance is not a bad thing. Again, it's complicated, and the way it's designed and works in this country is problematic in certain ways. But the point I brought up before, that we saw the risk, if we trust those prices, and put aside the other, it did what it was supposed to do, in the sense, like, it did price in that risk. Now there's other factors pushing prices up to these extraordinary levels. So, we can create these models that force people to internalize that. It's not really necessarily fair to, distribute that burden in the way that it is right now.
So we have time for one last question, and then we'll have to close. Okay?
So having intersected with these government programs and also philanthropic funds, one of the things we hear again and again is it takes so long to get money out the gate. If there was one piece of red tape you could cut, what would it be?
CDBG-DR should not be a
Oh, the whole
program
thing.
that relies, no, not cut it. It should not be a program that relies on an emergency supplemental by Congress.
That's exactly what I was.
So the way FEMA works now, of course, is emergency declaration or a disaster declaration from the White House through OMB. That comes about by the Disaster Relief Act of 1950. A simplistic process in the scheme of things that allows the White House, the executive, to say, this is a disaster, money goes out the door. If you make CDBG-DR a permanent program in the annual budget process, and then allow the executive, although Congress would be unlikely to do this right now, which is why, in my opinion, one of the reasons it hasn't happened, then allow the executive, in the form of the White House, to say, this is now a need of recovery fund, some other terminology to be created, and allow that money to get out the door in a relatively speedy way. Now, that may be not days after disaster, it may be 30 days after disaster once a report is submitted by the governor, for instance. But it's a lot faster if we're talking 30 days than getting an emergency supplemental through Congress, which can take months or years in some instances. again, make CDBG-TR permanent is one way to speed up the process.
There's
Could
so
you do
much you could do with that though.
I was gonna ask
Go
a question, could you, right, like, you're thinking about like all the advances in technologies we have, we can see these storms coming for, you know, weeks, I mean, could it be the case that you issue it before the storm even hits? So, I mean, or like on a, like, right, on a conditional way, because even that, like, to the point, like, even 30 days, you know, months is still too long for a lot of this, and I think it goes also to the, you need these recovery, you need the emergency mobilization, but you also just need this like constant preparedness, right, whether it's COVID or it's just, you know.
It gives states the confidence that money will be coming. The problem with
So they can
CDBG-DR
start taking
is
action,
you
yeah.
don't have
So you just
confidence
don't do
that Congress
anything.
will pass it. Well, no, you may be doing stuff. States will hire the consultants to build out the programs and it's in waiting period. But the confidence that's actually happening versus,
And what's
should.
gonna be in the enabling legislation, right? Every storm has a different.
correct, that's a whole nother set of rules that HUD then takes 60 days for HUD to put out the Federal Register notice, which may have different rules for X disaster versus Y disaster.
And was
So if
this
I
just
can
in a
jump in to
context of
ask
fewer,
another-
I just like,
Yeah.
it's just like it's happening more frequent now, you know, like just the frequency and the
It'd
magnitude.
be nice
of
if
the-
there was an annual Federal Register instead of.
If I can jump in to ask just one more question though, why frame it still on CDBG for disaster recovery and why not even elevate that to be agnostic to disaster for adaptation?
I love that idea because, I mean, it was challenging to take some of the money that was CDBGI that was tagged towards resiliency to really use it that way. So if it were both just a standing allocation, you could use it as resiliency, like pre-disaster, and you can get people the resources they need and access to the vendors and the contractors they need so that you could pay homeowners directly, right? If there is a community of vetted partners that, and the education and the resources are out there, then you don't necessarily need to have a system that's controlling for all of the potential fraud and risks, right? You can kind of prepare for that and be able to pay people directly. And people just need cash, whether it's for food, whether it's for temporary shelter, whether it's to make health-saving repairs due to mold and everything else.
And I would extend that to perhaps to renters rather than
For sure,
funneling
yeah.
the money towards property owners, which include homeowners and landlords. Is there a way to get cash directly in the hands of renters to support their financial resilience, their path to moving out of an area of risk, agnostic to disaster, because we know the planning projections.
And we're out of time, unfortunately, but this is a good place to end, I think. There are two things here. There's one is we're dealing with these policy frameworks that are reactive.
Yes.
And what we need is forward-looking policy, forward-looking strategies.
Yeah.
And I think that the really significant point here is that we keep talking about this as disaster, as this sort of exceptional state, these episodes of emergency. But, you know, in the discussions we've been having here at Columbia, the disaster is constant and ongoing in communities of color, in low-income communities, working-class communities. And the policies that we need to really get at the underlying problem here probably have less to do with natural disasters, more to do with responding to decades and histories of oppression, of inequality and exclusion. So thank you all so much. Was anyone inspired to present on this discussion? Any takers?
I can do it.
Great, thank you.